Some betrayals cut so deep they change a man forever. When the woman you once trusted strikes down the woman carrying your child, what kind of man do you become? In the frontier town of Cold Creek, mountain man Asa McGraw faced that very choice. Years back, he'd left behind a widow named Clara Dane, who believed they'd marry someday. But Asa returned with a new wife, Lydia, gentle and expecting their first baby. One morning, Clara's jealousy boiled over. She attacked Lydia right there in the street, in front of the whole town. Everyone knew Asa's reputation. They'd heard the stories whispered in saloons about what he was capable of. Now they waited to see his revenge. What happened next would shake the entire valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cold Creek sat in a valley where the mountains cast long shadows even at midday. It was 1887, and the town had grown up around a single dirt road that ran between the peaks like a scar on the earth. On one end stood the church with its white-painted steeple. On the other, the saloon with its weathered boards and the constant sound of men's voices drifting through the bat-wing doors. In between, life happened: the general store, the boarding house, Doc Holloway's office with its smell of carbolic acid and camphor, and the sheriff's office where Tom Birch kept the peace with more words than bullets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, sometimes before they knew it themselves. Gossip traveled faster than the morning stage, and secrets had a way of becoming common knowledge by supper time. But for all its flaws, Cold Creek took care of its own. When the Hendersons lost their barn to fire, every man in town showed up to rebuild it. When old Mrs. Fletcher took sick, the women brought enough food to feed an army. That was the way of things. Asa McGraw had left Cold Creek 5 years earlier, and folks still talked about it. He'd been younger then, raw around the edges, working as a tracker and hunter for whoever would pay. He'd had a way with the wilderness that made people uneasy. Too comfortable out there in the wild, too quiet when he came back to town. Some said he was part wolf himself, the way he could disappear into the trees and reappear miles away without making a sound. Back then, he'd taken up with Clara Dane, the young widow who ran the boarding house on the north end of town. Her husband, James Dane, had died of pneumonia that first winter after they'd married, leaving her alone at 23 with a business to run and a reputation to maintain. Clara was beautiful in a severe way, dark hair always pulled back tight, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that rarely smiled, but could cut a man down with a single word when needed. She and Asa had been drawn to each other like moths to flame, both lonely, both damaged in ways they couldn't quite explain. They'd meet in the evenings after her boarders had gone to bed, sit on her back porch and talk about things that mattered: loss, loneliness, what it meant to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop. It wasn't proper, people said, but Clara didn't much care about proper anymore. She'd done proper when she married James Dane, and look where that had gotten her. For nearly a year, they carried on that way. Not quite courting, not quite anything folks could name. Clara started imagining a future, Asa settling down, maybe taking over the livery, them getting married quiet-like and building a life together. She never said these things out loud, but everyone could see it in the way she looked at him, the way she laughed at his rare jokes, the way she kept his favorite coffee on hand. Then one morning, Asa simply left. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a brief word to Sheriff Birch that he was heading into the high country and didn't know when he'd be back. Clara had stood on her porch that day, watching the road long after he'd disappeared, and something in her had hardened like clay in a kiln. People tried to comfort her, but she didn't want comfort. She wanted Asa to come back and explain himself, to tell her why she hadn't been enough to make him stay. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and still she waited. The boarding house ran like clockwork because Clara threw herself into work, but anyone who looked close could see the light had gone out of her eyes. Years passed. Clara became colder, more isolated. She still ran the best boarding house in the valley, still showed up to church every Sunday, still did her duty as a citizen of Cold Creek, but she'd built walls around herself so high that nobody could climb them. When preacher Samuel Cord tried to talk to her about forgiveness, she listened politely and then went right back to her life of quiet bitterness. Then, on a bright morning in early spring, Asa McGraw came riding back into town. He looked different, older certainly, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. He'd grown a beard that was more grey than black, and his shoulders had broadened from the hard work of surviving alone in the mountains. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. They held a calmness that hadn't been there before, a kind of settled peace that made people take notice, and beside him, riding a gentle mare, was a woman nobody in Cold Creek had ever seen. Her name was Lydia, and she was nothing like Clara. Where Clara was all sharp edges and careful control, Lydia was soft and open. She had light brown hair that curled at her temples, hazel eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and a way of looking at people that made them feel seen. She was maybe 30, with laugh lines that suggested a life lived with joy rather than bitterness, and she was clearly expecting a child. Asa introduced her to Sheriff Birch first, then to Doc Holloway, and the word spread through town like wildfire. Asa McGraw had returned, and he'd brought a wife. They'd married 6 months earlier in a town called Silver Ridge, 2 valleys over. He'd met her there when he'd come down from the mountains one winter, needing supplies. She'd been working at her father's trading post, and they'd fallen into conversation the way people do when they recognize something in each other. Lydia's father had passed the previous year, and she'd been running the post alone. Asa had started staying longer on his supply trips, then longer still, until finally he'd asked her to marry him. They'd wed in a simple ceremony with just a few witnesses, and now they were coming to Cold Creek to build a proper life together. The town welcomed them mostly. Lydia had that effect on people. She made them want to be kind. She'd stop and admire Mrs. Patterson's garden, ask Mr. Chen at the general store about his daughter's wedding, bring Doc Holloway fresh-baked bread just because she'd made extra. Within a week, half the town was protective of her, and within 2 weeks, the other half had joined them. But Clara Dane watched from her boarding house window and felt something dark and terrible growing in her chest. She hadn't known Asa was coming back. Nobody had thought to warn her, and why would they? It had been 5 years. Surely she'd moved on. But Clara hadn't moved on at all. She'd just frozen in place, waiting, and now here he was with a wife, a pregnant wife. The life Clara had imagined for herself, handed to someone else like it meant nothing. Asa came to see her the day after he arrived. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, and tried to explain. He'd left because he was broken inside, he said. He'd needed to go into the mountains and figure out who he was, what kind of man he wanted to be. He'd spent years out there alone, wrestling with his demons, learning to be still. When he'd finally come down, he'd been different, ready for something he hadn't been ready for before. He was sorry, he said. He should have told her he was leaving. He should have been honest about what he could and couldn't offer. He'd been a coward, and he knew it. Clara had listened to all of this standing in her doorway, her face like stone. When he finished, she'd said, "You're forgiven," in a voice that made it clear nothing was forgiven at all. Then she'd closed the door in his face. Asa had stood there for a long moment, his old hunting knife with its carved elk handle hanging at his belt, a reminder of the years he'd spent surviving in the wilderness, of the life he'd left behind. Then he'd walked away, back to the small house he'd rented for himself and Lydia, and tried to put Clara out of his mind. But Cold Creek was a small town, and avoiding someone forever wasn't possible. Lydia, bless her heart, tried to befriend Clara. She didn't know the full history. Asa had told her there'd been someone before her, someone he'd hurt, but he'd been light on the details. Lydia, being Lydia, thought kindness might bridge whatever gap existed. She'd stopped by the boarding house one afternoon with a basket of muffins, smiling that open smile of hers. Clara had answered the door, taken one look at Lydia's rounded belly, and said she wasn't hungry. The coldness in her voice could have frozen the sun. Lydia had tried twice more, then finally accepted that some hurts were too deep for muffins to fix. The weeks passed. Asa found work easily enough. His skills were needed, and people respected him. He helped the blacksmith, did some tracking for ranchers who'd lost livestock, and started building a small addition onto the house for when the baby came. Lydia made friends, joined the church ladies' group, and generally became part of the fabric of Cold Creek in the way that good people do. And Clara watched it all from behind her walls, feeling the bitterness grow like poison ivy, choking everything else out. She tried to pray it away. Preacher Cord had talked about forgiveness so many times she could recite his sermons by heart. She knew intellectually that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. She knew all the right words, all the right thoughts, but knowing and feeling were two different countries. And Clara was trapped in the wrong one. She'd see them sometimes, Asa and Lydia, walking together in the evening. He'd have his hand on the small of her back, protective and gentle, and they'd be talking about ordinary things, what to name the baby, whether to plant tomatoes or beans, how the roof needed fixing before winter. The kind of comfortable married conversation that Clara had dreamed about for so long, it had become like a phantom limb, something she could still feel even though it had never actually existed. That was the cruelest part. It hadn't even been real between her and Asa, not really. They'd been two broken people, keeping each other company in the dark. But Clara had built a whole future out of those evening conversations, a whole life out of nothing but hope and loneliness. And when Asa left, he'd taken that imaginary future with him, leaving her with nothing but the cold reality of her empty boarding house and her empty bed and her empty heart. The town tried to be diplomatic. Nobody wanted to take sides, but it was hard not to notice the difference between the two women. Lydia brought light wherever she went. Clara brought a chill that made people want to move along quickly. Business concluded, no lingering necessary. Sheriff Tom Birch, who'd known both women for years, felt caught in the middle. He'd stop by Clara's boarding house sometimes, try to make small talk, see if she needed anything. She'd be polite, but distant, and he'd leave feeling like he'd somehow made things worse just by showing up. Doc Holloway, who treated everyone from cradle to grave and knew more secrets than the preacher, kept a worried eye on the situation. He'd seen feuds tear towns apart before, seen what happened when people let their hurts fester. He mentioned it to Preacher Cord one afternoon, and they'd both agreed to pray about it. Neither of them knew what else to do, because the truth was, Clara Dane hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been hurt, yes, but she wasn't breaking any laws or causing any trouble. She was just a woman living her life, running her business, keeping to herself. If there was ice in her voice when she spoke to Asa on the rare occasions their paths crossed, well, that was her right. If she turned and walked the other way when she saw Lydia coming, that was her choice to make. But everyone in Cold Creek could feel the tension building like a summer storm on the horizon. You couldn't see it yet, but you could feel it in the air, taste it on your tongue like copper pennies. Something was going to break. It was just a question of when and how badly. Asa felt it too. He'd catch Clara looking at him sometimes, and the hatred in her eyes would hit him like a physical blow. He'd tried to apologize, tried to make amends, but there was no making amends for the particular kind of hurt he'd caused. He'd given her hope and then abandoned her without a word. In Clara's mind, he'd stolen 5 years of her life. 5 years she could have spent moving on, finding someone else, building a different future. Instead, she'd spent them waiting for a man who'd never intended to return. At night, lying beside Lydia, with his hand resting gently on her belly, feeling his child move beneath his palm, Asa would think about Clara and feel the weight of his past mistakes. He'd been young and selfish and broken, and he'd hurt someone who'd shown him kindness when he needed it most. But he couldn't undo the past. He could only try to be a better man going forward, try to build something good with Lydia, try to be the kind of father his child deserved. He just hoped Cold Creek and Clara would let him. The morning it happened was unremarkable in every way except one. The sky was that particular shade of blue that promised good weather, and Main Street bustled with the usual Thursday morning activity. Mrs. Patterson was sweeping her porch. Mr. Chen was arranging apples in neat pyramids outside his store. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm, and somewhere a dog was barking at absolutely nothing. Lydia McGraw walked down the wooden sidewalk with a basket over her arm, her hand resting on the swell of her belly in that unconscious way pregnant women have. She was 7 months along now, moving a bit slower than usual, but still insisting on doing her own shopping. Asa had offered to come with her, but she'd shooed him away with a smile. He was building the cradle today, and she wanted it to be a surprise when it was finished. She stopped at the general store first, chatting with Mr. Chen about fabric for baby clothes. He showed her a soft cotton in pale yellow, good for either a boy or a girl, he said, and she ran her fingers over it, imagining the little gowns she'd sew. She bought 2 yards, along with thread and some buttons, and tucked them carefully into her basket. Outside, she paused to admire Mrs. Patterson's morning glories, which had just started to bloom. The older woman came down from her porch to talk about the best way to train the vines, and they stood there in the sunshine, 2 women discussing ordinary things in an ordinary way. Neither of them noticed Clara Dane emerge from her boarding house 3 buildings down. Clara had been awake since before dawn, pacing her empty rooms like a caged animal. She'd barely slept in weeks. Every night, she'd lie in her bed and think about Asa and Lydia in their little house, probably wrapped up in each other, probably happy. The thoughts ate at her like acid, corroding everything good inside her until all that remained was the hurt and the rage. She'd tried to control it. Lord knows she'd tried. But that morning, something inside her had finally snapped. She'd been standing at her window, watching Main Street come to life, when she saw Lydia step out of the general store. Saw her pause to talk to Mrs. Patterson, saw her laugh at something, her whole face lighting up with joy. Saw her hand rest on her pregnant belly, protective and tender. And something in Clara broke completely. She didn't remember deciding to leave the house. Didn't remember walking down her porch steps or crossing the street. It was like watching herself from a distance, seeing her own body move, but not quite controlling it. All she could think was, that should have been me. That life should have been mine. Lydia was saying goodbye to Mrs. Patterson when Clara reached her. Mrs. McGraw, Clara said, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Flat, dead. Lydia turned, and her smile faltered when she saw Clara's face. Mrs. Dane, she said carefully. Good morning, is it? Clara stepped closer. Is it a good morning for you? People were starting to notice now. Mr. Chen had come to his doorway. Mrs. Patterson had stopped mid-step on her way back to her porch. Down the street, the blacksmith's hammer had gone silent. I'm sorry? Lydia's hand moved instinctively to her belly. I don't understand. No, Clara said. You wouldn't. You blow into town and take everything, and you don't even understand what you've taken. Lydia's face softened with comprehension and something that looked like pity. Mrs. Dane, I know there's history between you and Asa. He told me. He told you? Clara laughed, and it was an ugly sound. What did he tell you? That he whispered promises to me for a year? That he made me believe in a future? That he left me waiting like a fool? He said he hurt you, Lydia said quietly. And I'm sorry for that, truly. But nothing. Clara's voice rose. You're sorry. You stand there with his child in your belly, with his ring on your finger, with everything I wanted, and you tell me you're sorry? The crowd was gathering now. Sheriff Birch had emerged from his office. Doc Holloway had stopped on his way to make house calls. A dozen townspeople had materialized, drawn by the raised voices and the tension crackling in the air like lightning about to strike. Mrs. Dane, Lydia said, and her voice was gentle, trying to de-escalate. I understand you're hurt, but this anger, it won't heal anything. It'll only make things worse. It was the wrong thing to say. The gentleness, the understanding, the pity in Lydia's voice. It was gasoline on Clara's fire. This woman, this stranger, presuming to understand her pain, presuming to offer wisdom about hurt and healing when she'd taken everything Clara had dreamed of. You don't understand anything, Clara said, and her hand moved before her brain could catch up. The slap connected with Lydia's cheek with a crack that echoed down Main Street. For a moment, everything froze. Lydia staggered backward, more from shock than force, her hand flying to her face. Her basket tumbled from her arm, spilling fabric and thread across the wooden sidewalk. Then Clara moved again. Later, people would disagree about exactly what happened next. Some said Clara shoved Lydia, others said she just reached out and Lydia, already off balance, fell. But everyone agreed on the result. Lydia went down hard, landing on her side on the wooden planks. She cried out, not loud, just a small sound of pain and surprise, and immediately curled around her belly, protecting the child inside her. The spell broke. People rushed forward. Mrs. Patterson reached Lydia first, dropping to her knees beside the younger woman. Doc Holloway was there a second later, his experienced hands already checking for injuries. Sheriff Birch grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her back. She didn't resist. She just stood there, staring at Lydia on the ground. And for a moment, her face showed nothing but horror at what she'd done. Then the walls slammed back into place, and her expression went blank. "Are you all right?" Doc Holloway was asking Lydia. "The baby. Can you feel the baby moving?" Lydia's face was pale, but she nodded. Yes, I think we're all right. Let's get you to my office. I need to examine you properly." Doc looked up at Sheriff Birch. "Tom, get some men to help me carry her." "I can walk," Lydia said, but her voice shook. "I'd prefer you didn't, just to be safe." Doc's voice was kind but firm. He gestured to two men standing nearby. "Careful now. Support her back and legs." They lifted her as gently as they could. Lydia's hand never left her belly, and Mrs. Patterson walked beside her, holding her other hand. The crowd parted to let them through, and that's when Asa appeared. He'd been in the livery, working on the cradle, when someone's son had come running with the news. He dropped his tools and run the 3 blocks to Main Street, his heart pounding with fear. Now he stood at the edge of the crowd, taking in the scene. Lydia being carried toward Doc's office, her face pale and frightened. The scattered contents of her basket on the sidewalk. Clara standing silent in Sheriff Birch's grip. Her cameo brooch, the one Asa had given her years ago, now cracked down the middle, hanging crooked on her dress, and every eye in town turning to watch his reaction. Asa's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Fear, anger, something that might have been grief, before settling into absolute stillness. His hand drifted to the hunting knife at his belt, that old companion from his years in the wilderness, but he didn't draw it. He just stood there, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle jumping. "Asa!" Doc Holloway called. "Come on! She's asking for you." Asa moved then, walking past Clara without so much as a glance. But everyone saw the way his hands were shaking. Everyone saw the cold fury in his eyes. Clara watched him go, and something inside her shriveled even further. She'd wanted him to look at her. She'd wanted him to see her, to acknowledge what he'd done to her, to feel even a fraction of the pain she'd been living with. Instead, he'd looked right through her, as if she didn't exist at all. Sheriff Birch's grip tightened on her arm. "Clara," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She let him lead her toward his office, moving like a sleepwalker. Behind them, the townspeople stood in stunned silence, looking at each other with wide eyes and shocked faces. In the 5 years since Asa had left, Clara Dane had been cold. She'd been distant. She'd been bitter and hard, but she'd never been violent. Something had changed. Something had broken, and everyone in Cold Creek knew that broken things could cut you if you weren't careful. In Doc Holloway's office, Asa sat beside Lydia's examination table, holding her hand so tight his knuckles were white. The doc was checking her carefully, listening to the baby's heartbeat with his stethoscope, pressing gently on her abdomen, asking questions in his calm, professional voice. "Any cramping? Any bleeding? Any sharp pains?" "No," Lydia said. "Just it scared me. The fall scared me." "That's understandable." Doc straightened up. "The baby's heartbeat is strong. No signs of distress. You've got some bruising coming up on your hip and elbow, but nothing's broken. You were lucky." "Lucky," Lydia repeated, and let out a shaky laugh. Doc looked at Asa. "She needs rest. Complete bed rest for the next few days, just to be safe. No lifting, no walking unless necessary. Keep an eye out for any cramping or bleeding. If anything changes, you come get me immediately." Asa nodded. He hadn't said a word since entering the office, Asa, Lydia said softly. Look at me. He did, and she saw what she'd expected. The fury, the guilt, the barely controlled violence simmering just beneath his carefully maintained calm. I'm all right, she said. We're all right. She attacked you. His voice was rough, like gravel. She put hands on you. She could have. He couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't. The baby's fine. I'm fine. This time. Asa stood abruptly, pacing to the window. What about next time? What if there won't be a next time? Lydia's voice was stronger now. Tom will handle it. That's his job. Will he? Asa turned back to her. You didn't see her face, Lydia. You didn't see... He stopped, running his hand through his hair. This is my fault. I did this to her. I made her into... No. Lydia sat up, despite Doc's protests. No, Asa, you hurt her, yes. You were thoughtless and cowardly when you left, and yes, that was wrong. But what she did today, that was her choice. Not yours, hers. Asa stared at his wife. This good woman who saw the best in everyone, who always tried to understand, who was defending him even now when she had every right to be angry, and he made a decision. I need to see Sheriff Birch, he said. Asa, I need to tell him what I want done about this. His voice was calm now, terrifyingly calm. She can't get away with this, Lydia. She can't. What are you going to do? He looked at her for a long moment. The right thing, he said finally. I hope. Then he walked out, leaving Lydia and Doc Holloway staring after him. Outside, the town waited. Word had spread fast, the way it always did in Cold Creek. By noon, everyone knew what had happened. By early afternoon, everyone had an opinion about what should be done. Some said Clara should be arrested, charged with assault. Others, particularly the older women who remembered her as a young bride before tragedy had hardened her, argued for leniency. She'd been hurt, they said. Driven to it, surely there was room for understanding. The men in the saloon had darker suggestions. A woman who'd attack a pregnant woman, that wasn't something you could forgive. Asa was a patient man, they said, but every man had his limits. They'd seen the way he looked. They knew what was coming. Some of them were excited about it, in the way men sometimes are about violence when it's not their own. They wanted to see the mountain man unleashed, wanted to see what Asa McGraw was really capable of when someone hurt what was his. In his office, Sheriff Tom Birch sat across from Clara Dane and tried to figure out how to handle this mess. Clara hadn't said a word since he'd brought her in. She just sat there, staring at her hands, that broken cameo brooch still pinned to her dress. Clara, Tom said gently, I need you to talk to me. Nothing. I've known you a long time. Since before James died, you're not a violent person. So I need to understand. What happened out there? Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. I don't know, she said. I saw her and I don't know. You assaulted a pregnant woman in front of half the town. I can't just let that go. I know. Asa's going to want justice. He has every right to press charges. You could go to jail, Clara. Is that what you want? What I want, Clara said bitterly, doesn't seem to matter much, does it? Tom sighed. This isn't about what you want or don't want. This is about what you did. You hurt someone. You put a baby at risk. There are consequences for that. Then give me the consequences. Clara's voice was flat. Lock me up. Throw me in a cell. I don't care anymore. That's the thing, Clara. I think you do care. I think you care so much it's eating you alive. She looked away. The door opened and Asa walked in. Tom stood up. Asa, how's Lydia? She'll be all right. Doc says the baby's fine. Asa's eyes were on Clara, and his expression was unreadable. I need to talk to you, Tom, about what happens next. Of course, Tom glanced at Clara. Give us a minute. No, Asa said. She should hear this. Clara's head came up, and for the first time since the attack, she looked directly at Asa. There was something like defiance in her face, mixed with fear and a kind of desperate hope that whatever he was about to say would finally make her feel something other than this terrible emptiness. Asa stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun, and everyone in Cold Creek held their breath, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. What kind of revenge he would take, what would happen to Clara Dane, and whether the fragile peace of their little town was about to shatter completely. The silence in Sheriff Birch's office stretched out like pulled taffy. Asa stood just inside the doorway, his frame blocking most of the light. Clara sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, that cracked cameo brooch catching the dim light. Tom waited, one hand resting on his desk, ready to intervene if necessary. "I'm not pressing charges," Asa said finally. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody moved. "What?" Tom said. "I'm not pressing charges." Asa's voice was steady, quiet. "Lydia and the baby are fine. No permanent harm done. I'm not going to have Clara arrested." Clara's face went white. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd been braced for his anger, prepared for his hatred. She'd been ready for him to demand justice, to see her punished, to finally give her the attention she craved, even if it came in the form of vengeance. But this calm dismissal, this refusal to engage, it was somehow worse than anything she'd imagined. "Asa," Tom said carefully, "she attacked your wife. In front of witnesses. You have every right." "I know my rights." Asa finally looked away from Clara, meeting the sheriff's eyes. "But exercising them won't fix anything. It'll just make everything worse. She could do it again." "She won't." Asa glanced back at Clara. "Will you?" Clara couldn't speak. She just shook her head, feeling tears prick at her eyes for the first time since this morning. "There you go." Asa turned to leave. "Wait," Clara's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" He stopped, his hand on the doorframe. For a long moment he didn't turn around. "Because I understand what I did to you," he said finally. "I left you without explanation, without closure. I let you build something in your head that I knew wasn't real, and then I ran away instead of being honest. You've been carrying that hurt for 5 years, and this morning it came out in the worst possible way. But punishing you won't undo my part in this. It won't make anything right, so that's it?" Clara's voice rose. You forgive me? Just like that?" Now Asa did turn around. "I didn't say I forgive you. What you did was wrong, Clara. You hurt someone I love. You put my child at risk. That's not something I'll forget." His jaw tightened. "But I'm not going to let this destroy you, or me, or this town." "How noble of you," Clara said bitterly. "It's not noble. It's practical." Asa's eyes were hard. "If I press charges, you go to jail. Then what? You come out angrier than before. You lose everything you've built. The town splits into factions, some supporting you, some supporting me. People stop speaking to each other. Families get divided." He shook his head. "I spent 5 years in the mountains learning that revenge doesn't heal anything. It just creates more wounds. I'm not doing that. Not to you, not to Lydia, not to our child, and not to Cold Creek." Tom Birch leaned back in his chair, studying Asa with new respect. That's a mature way of looking at it." "I'm not the same man I was 5 years ago," Asa said simply. "I hope I'm better." Clara stared at him, and something in her chest cracked open. All this time, she'd wanted him to see her, to acknowledge her pain, to understand what he'd done. And now he was doing exactly that, but not in the way she'd imagined. He wasn't fighting her. He wasn't punishing her. He was just letting her go. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Asa, I'm so sorry." "I know you are." His voice softened slightly. "But you need to apologize to the person you hurt, not to me." I can't. She won't want to see me. Maybe not today, but someday." Asa looked at Tom. "I want it on record that I'm not pressing charges. Whatever else happens is between you and Clara." Tom nodded slowly. "All right. I'll note it down. But Clara, you understand this doesn't mean there are no consequences. I'm going to have to ask you to stay away from the McGraws. If I see you anywhere near them, I'll have to take action." "I understand," Clara said. "Good." Tom stood up. "You're free to go." "But Clara, get some help. Talk to Preacher Cord. Talk to someone. This can't happen again." She nodded and stood on shaky legs. As she moved toward the door, she had to pass close to Asa. She paused, and for a moment they stood almost face to face. "I really am sorry," she said again. "I know," Asa replied. "I'm sorry too, for what I did to you back then. I should have been honest. I should have told you I wasn't ready for what you wanted. Instead, I just ran, and that was cowardly. You were young. That's not an excuse. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man he'd become. The lines around his eyes, the grey in his beard, the calm that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stone. He was different, genuinely different, and she realized with a horrible sinking feeling that she'd been holding on to a ghost. The Asa she'd been waiting for, the one she'd built up in her mind during those 5 long years, that man had never existed. She'd fallen in love with her own loneliness, her own need, and pinned it all on someone who'd never promised her anything. I hope, she started, then stopped. I hope you'll be happy. You and Lydia, you deserve it. So do you, Asa said. You deserve to be happy too, Clara, but you won't find it by holding on to the past. Then he stepped aside, letting her pass. Clara walked out of the sheriff's office and into the bright afternoon sunlight. Main Street was busy with people going about their business, but she could feel their eyes on her. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone had an opinion. She walked back to her boarding house with her head high, refusing to show how much it hurt, how much everything hurt. Inside, she climbed the stairs to her private rooms and finally let herself cry. She cried for the years she'd wasted, for the future she'd imagined that would never exist, for the woman she'd become, bitter and cold and capable of violence. She cried for James, her first husband, who'd been kind to her in his way and hadn't deserved to be mourned so briefly before she moved on to pining for someone else. She cried for Asa, for the hurt she'd caused him and the hurt he'd caused her. She cried for Lydia, who'd done nothing wrong except exist and be loved, and she cried for herself, for the girl she'd been before grief and disappointment had turned her into this. When the tears finally stopped, she sat on her bed and looked around her empty room. The boarding house was doing well financially. She had security, a business, a place in the community. But she had no real friends, no family. No one who cared whether she lived or died beyond how it might affect their room and board. She'd done that to herself, pushed everyone away, built walls so high nobody could climb them. But maybe it wasn't too late to change that. The thought terrified her. Change meant vulnerability. It meant admitting she'd been wrong, that she'd wasted years on bitterness. It meant forgiving Asa, forgiving herself, and trying to build something new from the ruins of what she'd imagined. She didn't know if she was strong enough for that, but she also didn't know if she could go on the way she had been. Her fingers touched the broken cameo brooch still pinned to her dress. Asa had given it to her during those months they'd spent together. She'd worn it every day since, even after he left, a constant reminder of what she'd lost. Slowly, carefully, she unpinned it. The pieces came apart in her hands, the delicate profile of a woman's face now split in two, just like her, split in two by grief and bitterness. But things that broke could be mended. It wouldn't be the same. You'd always see the crack. But it could be whole again, in a different way. Clara set the pieces on her dresser and stood up. Her legs still felt shaky, but she made herself walk to the door, down the stairs, out onto her porch. The sun was setting now, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. People were heading home for supper. She could smell wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. Cold Creek was a good town, despite everything. People here took care of each other. They had long memories, but also big hearts. If she could show them she was trying to change, really trying, maybe there was hope for her yet. She saw Preacher Samuel Cord walking past on his way back from visiting the sick. He noticed her standing on the porch and paused. "Clara," he said carefully, "how are you?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. "Not good," she admitted. "But I'd like to talk, if you have time, about everything." Preacher Cord was a tall man in his 50s, with kind eyes and hands that had comforted more grieving people than he could count. He studied Clara for a moment, then nodded. "I always have time," he said. "Come by the church tomorrow morning. We'll talk as long as you need to." "Thank you," Clara whispered. He tipped his hat to her and continued on his way. Clara stood on her porch a while longer, watching the town settle in for the evening. Somewhere out there, Asa was probably sitting down to supper with Lydia, maybe resting his hand on her belly to feel the baby kick, talking about their day in that easy way married people had. And for the first time in 5 years, Clara felt something other than bitter jealousy when she thought about them. She felt not quite forgiveness. Not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. The first small step toward letting go. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, in the small house at the edge of town, Asa sat beside Lydia's bed where Doc Holloway had insisted she stay. He'd made her soup and brought her tea and fussed over her until she'd laughed and told him to sit down before he wore himself out. Now they sat in comfortable silence, her hand in his, while the lamplight flickered and cast shadows on the walls. "You did the right thing," Lydia said finally. "Not pressing charges, did I?" Asa looked troubled. "Tom thinks I'm being too soft. Half the town probably thinks the same. Let them think what they want. You made the choice that will let everyone heal. That takes more strength than revenge ever could." Asa's hand drifted to the locket Lydia wore around her neck, the one with her mother's picture inside. She told him once about how her mother had taught her that forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about freeing yourself from the poison of hatred. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said. "She was." Lydia squeezed his hand. "And so's my husband. I don't feel wise. I feel—" He struggled for words. "I'm still angry, Lydia. When I think about Clara putting her hands on you, I know. But you didn't act on that anger. You chose something better." "I hope so." Asa was quiet for a moment. "In the mountains, during those 5 years, I had a lot of time to think. About who I'd been, the people I'd hurt, the mistakes I'd made. I didn't like the man I saw when I really looked at myself. And so you changed. I tried to. I'm still trying to." He looked at their joined hands. "But it's hard. The old instincts are still there. When I saw you on the ground today, I wanted to hurt Clara, really hurt her. And part of me still does, but you won't." "No, I won't." He met Lydia's eyes. "Because I don't want our child growing up with a father who solves problems with violence. I don't want to be that kind of man anymore." Lydia raised their joined hands and kissed his knuckles. "You're already not that man. You haven't been for a long time." They sat together as full darkness fell outside, and the sounds of Cold Creek settling down for the night drifted through the window. Somewhere a baby was crying. Somewhere else someone was playing a fiddle. Normal sounds of normal life in a normal town, but nothing felt quite normal anymore. Something had shifted today. A line had been crossed and then, surprisingly, uncrossed. Asa had been given a chance to show the town who he really was, and he'd taken it. Now everyone would have to figure out what that meant. In the church rectory, Preacher Cord sat at his desk with his worn Bible open in front of him. The pages were heavily annotated, passages on forgiveness underlined multiple times, notes written in the margins about grace and mercy and the difficulty of both. He'd been praying about Clara Dane for years. He'd watched her grow harder and more isolated, watched the light go out of her eyes. He'd tried to reach her, but she'd always kept him at arm's length. Now, finally, something had broken through. It had taken a terrible action and its equally terrible consequences, but maybe, just maybe, Clara was finally ready to let someone help her. He marked his place in the Bible and bowed his head. He prayed for Clara, that she'd find the strength to change. He prayed for Lydia, that she and the baby would stay healthy. He prayed for Asa, that he'd have the wisdom to navigate the difficult days ahead. And he prayed for Cold Creek itself, that the town would find a way to heal from this wound before it festered into something worse. Because Preacher Cord knew something that most of the townspeople didn't quite understand yet. This wasn't over. The immediate crisis had passed, but the real work, the work of forgiveness and transformation and community healing, was just beginning, and it would test all of them before it was done. That evening, after Doc Holloway had checked on Lydia one more time and confirmed that both she and the baby seemed fine, Asa sat alone on his porch. The house was small but well built, with a view of the mountains he'd called home for so long. Tonight, those peaks were silhouetted against a sky full of stars, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. He'd sent a neighbor boy to fetch his tools from the livery, and now the half-finished cradle sat beside him on the porch, a reminder of the life he was trying to build. He picked up his sanding block and went back to work, letting the repetitive motion calm his still racing thoughts. Inside, Lydia was finally sleeping. He'd sat with her until her breathing had deepened and her face had relaxed. Even in sleep, she kept one hand on her belly, protecting their child. The sight had made something twist in his chest, love and fear and determination all mixed together. He'd meant what he said to Sheriff Birch. He wasn't the same man who'd left Cold Creek 5 years ago. That man had been running from everything, his feelings, his responsibilities, his past. He'd convinced himself that solitude was strength, that needing nothing from anyone made him invulnerable. It had taken 3 years alone in the mountains to realize he'd been wrong. The wilderness had taught him things, patience, observation, the value of stillness. He'd learned to track animals not by chasing them, but by understanding their patterns, by moving with the land instead of against it. He'd learned that survival wasn't about dominating nature, but about finding your place within it, and slowly, painfully. He'd learned to sit with his own thoughts without running from them. He'd thought about Clara during those years, about how he'd used her loneliness for his own comfort, without considering what she might be building in her mind, about how easy it had been to take what she offered without giving anything real in return, about how he'd been so trapped in his own pain after losing his parents that he couldn't see hers. By the 4th year, he'd known he needed to come back down, not to Cold Creek necessarily, but to people, to community, to life. He'd met Lydia by accident, if accidents existed, which Preacher Cord would say they didn't. Divine providence, the preacher would call it. Asa didn't know about that, but he knew that walking into that trading post in Silver Ridge had changed everything. Lydia had been sorting inventory, and she'd looked up when he entered, and smiled like he was a friend she'd been expecting rather than a stranger covered in trail dust. They'd talked while she filled his supply order, and he'd found himself lingering, asking questions he didn't need answers to, just to keep the conversation going. He'd come back the next week, and the week after that, and by the 3rd visit, he'd stopped pretending he needed supplies. What had drawn him to her was hard to put into words. She was pretty, yes, but Cold Creek had pretty women. She was kind, but kindness alone wouldn't have been enough. It was something deeper, a quality of acceptance, of seeing who he actually was rather than who he'd been or might become. She'd looked at him, this rough mountain man with more silence than words, and hadn't tried to change him. She just liked him, as he was. And somehow, in her presence, he'd started liking himself again too. When her father died suddenly of a heart ailment, Asa had stayed to help her through it. They'd buried the old man on a hillside overlooking the valley, and afterward, Lydia had taken Asa's hand and said, "I'm glad you were here. I don't think I could have done this alone." He'd proposed 3 weeks later, kneeling in the trading post after hours with a simple ring he'd traded for. She'd said yes before he'd finished asking the question. They'd married quietly, just them, and a justice of the peace because neither of them wanted a fuss. Then they'd spent a few months getting the trading post ready to sell, and Lydia had asked where he wanted to settle. "I know a place," he'd said, "if you don't mind a small town." "I grew up in a small town," she'd replied. Small towns are good for raising children. The fact that she assumed they'd have children, that she was planning a future with him so easily, it had made him realize how much he wanted that same future. Not the vague someday he'd let Clara imagine, but actual concrete plans. This woman, this life, these mountains. So he'd brought her to Cold Creek. He hadn't told her much about Clara. He'd said there was someone he'd been involved with, someone he'd hurt, and that it might be awkward. Lydia had listened and squeezed his hand and said, "Then we'll work through it together." She'd tried, bless her. She'd tried to befriend Clara, to build a bridge. But some canyons were too wide for bridges. Asa set down his sanding block and ran his hand over the cradle's smooth wood. Oak strong and lasting. He wanted this cradle to be something his child could use, and maybe his grandchildren someday. Something that would last. He'd thought about Clara's words in the sheriff's office, the hurt in her voice when she asked why he was letting her go without punishment. Part of her had wanted him to press charges, he realized. Wanted the drama of it, the attention, the proof that she still mattered to him enough to inspire his vengeance. But giving her that would have been another kind of cruelty. It would have kept her trapped in this story, where he was the center of her world, the villain or the hero, but either way, the focus of all her emotion. The kindest thing he could do was refuse to play that role. To step back and let her find her own way forward without him. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Or maybe it was, but not the way people usually meant it. He wasn't saying what she'd done was okay. He wasn't saying it didn't matter. He was just refusing to let it become the thing that defined both of their futures. He picked up his tools again and got back to work. The cradle wouldn't build itself, and he wanted it finished before the baby came. Across town, Clara lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She'd stopped crying hours ago, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lydia falling, saw the fear on her face, heard the small sound she'd made when she hit the ground. Clara had hurt people before with her words, sharp comments, cold dismissals, the kind of everyday cruelties that small-town life sometimes demanded. But she'd never been physically violent. She'd prided herself on her control, her dignity, her ability to maintain proper behavior no matter what she felt inside. Today, she'd lost all of that in a single moment of rage. The worst part was understanding that Asa was right. She'd been manipulated by her own expectations, trapped in a story she'd written in her head where she was the tragic heroine waiting for her love to return. She'd cast Asa in a role he'd never agreed to play, and when he didn't follow her script, she'd felt betrayed. But he hadn't betrayed her. He'd just been human, flawed and struggling and unable to give her what she wanted because he didn't have it to give. She thought about the years she'd spent waiting, all the evenings on her porch watching the road, all the times she'd heard footsteps and felt her heart leap, hoping it was him, all the conversations she'd invented in her mind, the explanations he'd offer, the apologies, the reunion. She'd been so focused on that imagined future that she'd stopped living in the present. Her boarding house could have been more than just a business. She could have made real friends instead of just maintaining professional relationships with her tenants. She could have joined the church ladies group, helped with community events, built a life that wasn't just waiting for someone else to give it meaning. Instead, she'd frozen herself in amber, preserved in the moment Asa left, unable or unwilling to move forward. And today, all that frozen grief had cracked open and spilled out in the worst possible way. Clara sat up and lit the lamp on her bedside table. The broken cameo brooch sat on her dresser, catching the light. She picked up the pieces and held them in her palm. She could have it repaired, probably. Mr. Chen at the general store was handy with delicate work. But did she want to? Did she want to keep wearing this reminder of what she'd lost? Or was it time to let it go? She set the pieces back down, not ready to decide yet. Some choices couldn't be rushed. Tomorrow she'd go see Preacher Cord like she'd promised. She'd tell him everything, not just what happened today, but all of it. The loneliness after James died. The way Asa's attention had felt like sunlight after a long winter. The hopes she'd built, and the years she'd wasted, and the person she'd become. Maybe he could help her find a way forward. Maybe he'd have answers, or at least questions that would help her find her own answers. Or maybe he'd just listen, and that would be enough for now. Clara lay back down and pulled the covers up. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The sounds of the wilderness that surrounded their little town, reminding them all how small and fragile their civilization really was, but also how precious, how worth protecting. She closed her eyes and tried again to sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Asa woke early, as was his habit, and checked on Lydia. She was still sleeping peacefully, one hand on her belly. He watched her for a moment, feeling the familiar surge of gratitude that she was his, that she'd chosen him, that somehow he'd been given this chance at a real life. Then he went outside to work on the cradle. He'd been at it for maybe an hour when Sheriff Birch came walking up the path. "Morning, Asa," Tom called. "Got a minute?" Asa set down his tools. "Sure, coffee." Wouldn't say no. They went inside, moving quietly so as not to wake Lydia. Asa poured 2 cups from the pot he'd made earlier, and they settled at the kitchen table. "How's she doing?" Tom asked. "Better. No cramping, no bleeding. Doc says that's a good sign." "Good, that's good." Tom wrapped his hands around his cup. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about yesterday. About your decision not to press charges. You think I made a mistake. I think," Tom chose his words carefully, "I think you made the decision that felt right to you. But I'm worried about what it might mean for the town." "How so?" "Word's spreading. Some folks are saying you're too soft, that Clara got away with something she shouldn't have. There's talk that if a man won't even protect his own wife, what good is he?" Asa's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Let them talk. It's not just talk I'm worried about. Cyrus Dane, Clara's brother-in-law, he rode into town late yesterday. Stayed at the boarding house. He's asking questions, making noise about family honor." Now Asa's attention sharpened. "I didn't know Clara had family. Just Cyrus, James Dane's younger brother. He's got a ranch about 30 miles south, made good money in cattle. He and Clara never got along, something about how she ran the business after James died. But now he's here and he's angry. Angry at Clara or angry at me? Both, from what I hear." Tom took a sip of coffee. "He thinks you letting Clara go unpunished makes his family look weak. Says it's an insult." Asa stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. "So he wants me to press charges after all? Make it official?" "I don't think that's what he wants. I think," Tom hesitated, "I think he wants to handle it his own way. Family justice, he called it." "Meaning what? He punishes Clara himself? Or he comes after me for not punishing her?" "I don't know yet. But Asa, the man's got a reputation. He's proud, he's got money, and he's used to getting his way. This situation, it's complicated for him. His brother's widow attacked the wife of his brother's rival, and now I wasn't James's rival. I barely knew the man, maybe not. But in Cyrus's mind, you're the man who moved in on his brother's widow. The man who rejected her and then came back with a replacement. The man who's now showing her mercy, which he sees as condescension." Asa turned back to face Tom. "What do you suggest I do?" "I don't know," Tom admitted. "I'm just telling you to be careful. Watch your back. And maybe reconsider staying close to home for a while. Keep Lydia safe. I'm not going to hide in my own house. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be smart." Tom stood. "Look, you made your choice about Clara, and I respect that. But choices have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come from directions you don't expect." After Tom left, Asa stood in his kitchen and thought about the warning. He didn't know Cyrus Dane, but he knew the type, men who measured their worth by their pride, who saw compromise as weakness and mercy as cowardice. He'd met plenty of men like that in his years working as a tracker. They were the ones who'd hire him to hunt down a wolf that killed one sheep and wouldn't be satisfied until every wolf in the territory was dead. The ones who'd start feuds over water rights that could have been settled with conversation. The ones who'd rather burn their own fields than let a neighbor benefit from their misfortune. Dangerous men in their own way. Not because they were particularly skilled or smart, but because they were unpredictable and willing to escalate any situation to prove a point. Asa went back outside and picked up his tools. The cradle was nearly finished now. Just a few more hours of work and it would be ready. He'd deal with Cyrus Dane if and when the man made his move. Until then, he had a life to build and a family to protect, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone, Clara's bitterness or Cyrus's pride or the town's gossip, stop him from doing exactly that. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Clara had made her way to the church. It was a simple building, white clapboard with a small steeple, sitting on a slight rise that gave it a view of the whole valley. The doors were always unlocked, Preacher Cord's way of saying everyone was welcome any time. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old wood. Light streamed through the plain glass windows, throwing patterns on the worn floorboards. Clara stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. She hadn't been inside except for Sunday services in years, and even those she'd attended out of obligation rather than faith. Clara. Preacher Cord emerged from the small office at the back. He was carrying his Bible, the one he'd had for 30 years, its leather cover worn soft from handling. "Come in, please." She walked down the aisle between the simple wooden pews, her footsteps echoing. When she reached the front, she wasn't sure whether to sit or stand. "Wherever you're comfortable," Cord said gently, sensing her uncertainty. She chose a pew near the front and sat. He settled beside her, not too close, giving her space. "I don't know where to start," Clara said. "Start anywhere. God's patient, and so am I." So she started. Not with yesterday's attack, but further back. With James dying and leaving her alone at 23. With the weight of running the boarding house by herself. The whispers about whether a young widow could maintain propriety. With the loneliness that had felt like drowning. People were kind, she said. They helped. But nobody really saw me. I was James's widow, the boarding house lady. Someone to be pitied and helped, but not known. Cord nodded, listening without interrupting. Then Asa came along. He was different. He didn't pity me. He didn't try to fix me. He just sat with me. Talked to me like I was a person, not a widow. You fell in love with him. I thought I did. Now I'm not sure. Clara twisted her hands in her lap. Maybe I just fell in love with feeling seen. With having someone pay attention to me. With not being alone. Those are real needs, Cord said. There's no shame in them. But I built a whole future out of nothing. He never promised me anything. Never said he loved me. Never talked about marriage. But I convinced myself it was only a matter of time. I wrote a whole story in my head, and when he left I felt like he'd stolen it from me, when really he just didn't know the story existed. Clara looked at the preacher. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just old, and I've heard a lot of confessions." Cord opened his Bible, finding a passage by instinct. The pages fell open to a section so heavily annotated that the margins were dark with ink. "There's a story in here about a woman caught in adultery. You know it? The one where Jesus says, 'Let he who is without sin cast the first stone.' That's the one everyone remembers. But there's another part. After everyone leaves, Jesus tells the woman, 'Go and sin no more.' Not pretend it didn't happen. Not you're forgiven so it doesn't matter. But go and sin no more. Move forward, change, be different." That's what Asa said to me. That I need to apologize to Lydia. Not to him. "He's right." Cord closed the Bible. "Clara, you've been trapped in the past for 5 years. You've turned your hurt into a cage and locked yourself inside. Yesterday that cage finally broke open, and what came out was violence. That's your sin. Not loving Asa, not being hurt by him, but letting that hurt turn you into someone capable of attacking a pregnant woman." The words stung because they were true. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes again. "I don't know how to be different. None of us do at first. Change is frightening. It means letting go of the stories we tell ourselves, even the painful ones. Sometimes we hold on to pain because at least it's familiar. So what do? You start small. You apologize to Lydia when she's ready to hear it. You accept that Asa has moved on and let him go. You start building a life that doesn't center around what you've lost." Cord paused. "And you forgive yourself, which might be the hardest part of all. How? One day at a time, one choice at a time, choosing kindness over bitterness, choosing to move forward instead of looking back, choosing to see other people instead of just your own pain." Clara sat in silence for a long moment. The church was so quiet she could hear birds singing outside, the sound of someone hammering something in the distance. The ordinary sounds of life going on. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good. Fear means you're taking this seriously." Cord smiled slightly. "But you're not alone. That's what community is for, to help each other through the hard changes. Let people help you, Clara. Let them in. They probably hate me now. Some might. Some might never forgive you. But most will surprise you if you give them the chance." They sat together a while longer. Cord prayed, his voice low and steady, asking God for strength for Clara, for healing for Lydia, for wisdom for Asa, for peace for Cold Creek. Clara didn't know if she believed in prayer, but she found the sound of it comforting anyway. When she finally left the church, the sun was past noon. She felt wrung out but also lighter somehow, like she'd put down a heavy pack she'd been carrying for miles. She walked back toward the boarding house, but paused when she saw a man standing on her porch. He was tall and thick through the shoulders, wearing a suit that looked expensive, but somehow wrong on him, like he was more comfortable in work clothes. His face was florid, his expression stern. Cyrus Dane. She recognized him even though it had been years since she'd seen him. "Clara," he said when she approached. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About yesterday. About you disgracing the Dane name. About what I'm going to do about it." Clara's momentary peace evaporated. "I don't see how it's any of your business, Cyrus. Your family. That makes it my business." He came down the steps, and she noticed he was wearing silver spurs that jangled with each step. Purely decorative. Nobody wore spurs in town, but they announced his presence. Made sure everyone knew he was there. "You attacked that woman in front of the whole town. Made us look like what? Like I'm human. Like I made a mistake. Like we're weak." His voice rose. "Like the Dane family can be pushed around. That mountain man, he should have pressed charges. Should have demanded justice. Instead, he just let you go. Like you're not worth the trouble." "Maybe I'm not," Clara said tiredly. "Maybe he just doesn't want more conflict. Doesn't want—" Cyrus stared at her. "Where's your pride, woman? Where's your anger? He humiliated you, threw you over for some soft little thing, and then when you finally stood up for yourself, he dismissed you like you were nothing." "I didn't stand up for myself. I attacked a pregnant woman." "That's not standing up, that's—" Clara stopped. "Why are you really here, Cyrus?" "I told you. Family honor. You never cared about family honor before. You couldn't even be bothered to come to James's funeral. A flash of something, guilt maybe, crossed his face. That was different. How? James and I, we had our differences, but he was still my brother, and you were still his wife. I should have—" He shook his head. "That's not the point. The point is, I'm here now, and I'm going to fix this mess you've made. There's nothing to fix." Asa made his decision. Sheriff Birch agreed. "It's over. It's not over. Not by a long shot." Cyrus's hand moved to rest on the silver spurs at his belt, a gesture that seemed habitual. "I've been asking around. Seems this Asa McGraw isn't quite the upstanding citizen everyone thinks he is." Clara felt a chill. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about his time in the mountains. 5 years is a long time for a man to be alone. Makes you wonder what he was running from. Makes you wonder what he might have done out there, where nobody could see." "Don't," Clara said. "Whatever you're planning, don't. I'm not planning anything. I'm just curious. And I have friends who might be curious too. Friends who can ask questions, dig around, see what they can find." Cyrus smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Maybe there's a reason McGraw doesn't want attention from the law. Maybe pressing charges against you would have brought scrutiny he can't afford. You're making things up. You don't know anything about him." "Not yet. But I will." He tipped his hat to her. "I'll be staying in town for a while. Got some business to attend to. I'll see you around, Clara." He walked away, those silver spurs jangling with each step, and Clara stood on her porch, feeling the dread settle into her bones. She'd thought yesterday was the end of this mess. But watching Cyrus walk away, she realized it might just have been the beginning. She needed to warn Asa. Cyrus was dangerous in a different way than her violent outburst had been. He was calculating, patient, and he had resources. If he decided to make trouble, he could tear this town apart. But how could she warn Asa? She'd attacked his wife. He'd shown her mercy, but that didn't mean he wanted to talk to her. Sheriff Birch had told her to stay away from the McGraws. Still, she had to try. Whatever Asa had or hadn't done to her, he didn't deserve whatever Cyrus was planning. Clara went inside and changed into clean clothes, then walked to the sheriff's office. Tom Birch was at his desk, going through papers. "Clara," he said, looking up in surprise. "What can I do for you?" "I need to talk to Asa. It's important." Tom frowned. "I don't think that's a good idea. Lydia needs rest, and it's about Cyrus Dane. He's planning something bad. I don't know what exactly, but I think Asa should know. Tom's expression shifted from surprise to concern. What did Cyrus say? Clara told him everything. The conversation on her porch, the hints about Asa's past, the veiled threats. Tom listened with growing worry. "I'll talk to Asa," Tom said when she finished. "You go home. Let me handle this." "But Clara," his voice was firm but not unkind. "You did the right thing coming to me, but you need to let me take it from here. Understood?" She nodded reluctantly and left. Tom immediately headed to Asa's house. He found the mountain man still working on the cradle, surrounded by wood shavings and tools. "Tom," Asa said. "Back so soon? We've got a problem." "Clara came to see me. Says Cyrus is planning something. Making hints about your past, talking about digging up dirt." Asa's hands stilled on the wood. "What kind of dirt?" She wasn't specific, but she seemed genuinely worried. Tom paused. "Is there anything in your past that could cause trouble? Anything I should know about?" For a long moment, Asa didn't answer. Then he set down his tools and met Tom's eyes. "5 years ago, when I went into the mountains, I did some things I'm not proud of. Nothing criminal, but not things I'd want spread around." He took a breath. "I was drinking too much, getting into fights, making trouble. That's part of why I left, to get away from that version of myself before I did something really stupid. Anything specific Cyrus could use against you?" "There was one fight up in a mining camp. Man accused me of cheating at cards. I didn't, but he wouldn't let it go. We fought and I hurt him pretty bad. Nothing permanent, but bad enough that I left the camp the next day. Never found out what happened to him. Tom absorbed this." "Could Cyrus find out about it?" "If he's determined enough, maybe. Mining camps keep records sometimes. And men talk. Damn." Tom rubbed his face. "All right, here's what we do. You don't give him any ammunition. You keep your nose clean, stay close to home. Don't rise to any bait. Let me keep an eye on Cyrus, see what he's up to, and if he makes his move anyway, then we deal with it. But Asa, you need to be straight with me. Is there anything else? Anything worse than a bar fight?" Asa shook his head. "Nothing criminal. I give you my word." "All right," Tom stood. "I believe you. But we need to be prepared. Men like Cyrus, they don't need the truth. They just need enough smoke to make people wonder if there's fire." After Tom left, Asa went inside. Lydia was awake, sitting up in bed with a book. "Who was that?" she asked. "Tom. Seems there might be some trouble brewing." He told her about Cyrus, about the threats, about his own past in the mining camps. Lydia listened quietly, then reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "For being honest, you're not worried." "About a bar fight 5 years ago?" "No," she squeezed his hand. "But I'm worried about this Cyrus person. He sounds like someone who wants a fight. Whether there's a reason for one or not, I won't give him one. I promise myself no more violence." "I meant it." "I know you did." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "But sometimes violence comes looking for you, even when you don't want it." Asa thought about the hunting knife at his belt, about the years he'd spent surviving in the wilderness, about all the skills he'd developed for tracking and fighting and staying alive in hard country. He'd put all of that behind him when he came down from the mountains. He'd decided to be a different kind of man, but Lydia was right. Sometimes violence came looking for you, and when it did, you had to be ready to meet it, not with more violence if you could help it, but with the kind of strength that didn't depend on fists or weapons. The kind of strength that came from knowing exactly who you were and refusing to be anyone else, no matter the pressure. That was the real test ahead of them, Asa realized. Not whether he could fight Cyrus or his schemes, but whether he could stand firm in his decision to be a man of peace, while everyone around him tried to push him into being something else. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the sky. In the saloon, men talked about Asa and Clara and what should have happened. At the boarding house, Cyrus Dane sat in his room making plans. At the church, Preacher Cord prayed for wisdom and guidance, and all of Cold Creek waited to see what would happen next, sensing that the real storm was just beginning to gather on the horizon, the peaceful resolution everyone had hoped for. Yesterday was looking less and less likely, with each passing hour, and the question on everyone's mind was simple. How far would Cyrus Dane go to restore what he saw as his family's honor? Nobody knew the answer yet, but they were all about to find out. By early afternoon, Cyrus Dane had made himself a fixture in Cold Creek's saloon. He sat at a corner table buying rounds for anyone who'd listen, asking casual questions that weren't casual at all. "This McGraw fellow," he'd say, nursing his whiskey. "He spent, 5 years in the mountains? Men can get pretty wild out there away from civilization. Makes you wonder what might have happened." The men would shrug, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but not quite willing to defend Asa too strongly. Cyrus had money, and money talked even in a small town like Cold Creek. "Heard he was a tracker before he left," someone ventured. "Good at it too, tracker," Cyrus rolled the word around. "That's interesting. My brother James used to tell me about some trackers he knew, men who'd do anything for money. Punt anything, anyone, you know what I mean?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. "Now wait a minute," said Buck Henderson, the blacksmith. "Asa never did anything like that. He tracked animals mostly. Sometimes a lost cow or a missing person." "Missing person," Cyrus leaned forward. "Tell me about that." "There's nothing to tell. Mrs. Fletcher's grandson wandered off once. Asa found him in half a day. Kid was fine. Good, good. But there must have been other times. Other searches. Not all of them ending so well, I imagine." Buck shifted uncomfortably. "I wouldn't know about that." "No?" Cyrus smiled. "Well, maybe I'll ask around. Talk to folks in the mining camps, the logging operations, places where men go and sometimes don't come back. You'd be surprised what you can learn if you know where to look." He stood up, leaving his empty glass on the table. "Thanks for the conversation, gentlemen. Very enlightening." After he left, the men looked at each other uneasily. "He's stirring up trouble," Buck said. "That he is," agreed another. "Question is, why?" "Family pride, he says. But seems like more than that to me. Seems like he's got a grudge against McGraw, specifically. Or maybe he's just the kind of man who likes causing problems. Some men are like that. They drank in silence for a while, each contemplating what Cyrus's presence might mean for their peaceful town. Meanwhile, at the McGraw house, Lydia had insisted on getting up despite Doc Holloway's orders. She was tired of lying in bed, she said, and the baby was fine, kicking regularly, no cramping, no bleeding. She wanted to feel like herself again. Asa had helped her to the kitchen table, where she sat with her sewing, working on tiny clothes for the baby. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, creating delicate stitches in soft fabric. "Tell me more about Cyrus," she said as she worked. Asa, who was at the stove making tea, didn't turn around. "I don't know much. Never met him before yesterday, but you knew James, Clara's first husband, barely. He died not long after I came to Cold Creek the first time. I saw him around town, spoke to him once or twice, but that was it. What was he like?" "Quiet, kept to himself mostly. Ran a small freight business before he got sick. Clara took it over after he died, turned it into the boarding house." Lydia was quiet for a moment, her needle pausing. "She must have loved him, I suppose. And then he died, and she was alone, and you came along." "Lydia, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just trying to understand." She resumed her sewing. "She lost her husband. She was grieving, vulnerable. You were there, and you paid attention to her. Of course she attached herself to you. Of course she imagined a future. I should have been clearer. Should have told her I wasn't ready for that. Maybe. Or maybe she wouldn't have heard you even if you had. Sometimes we hear what we want to hear, especially when we're lonely." Asa brought the tea to the table and sat down across from her. "How did I end up with someone so wise?" "I'm not wise. I've been lonely too. After my father died, before you came along, I spent months running that trading post by myself. I'd go days without real conversation. Just transactions, just business. I know what it's like to crave connection, but you didn't. You didn't build a whole future in your head based on a few conversations. Didn't I?" Lydia smiled slightly. "The first time you came to the trading post, I noticed your eyes. How careful they were. How they took in everything. And I thought, this is a man who's survived things. This is a man who knows how to endure. I wanted to know what those things were. I wanted to know you. That's different, is it? Or did I just get lucky that you wanted to know me back?" Asa reached across the table and took her hand. "I love you. I know. And I love you. But Asa, We have to acknowledge that circumstances matter. Timing matters. If you'd met Clara at a different time in your life, or if I'd met you at a different time in mine, everything might have been different. Are you saying what happened with Clara is just bad timing? I'm saying it's more complicated than you being the villain and her being the victim, or vice versa. You're both just people who were hurting, who found some comfort in each other, and who ultimately wanted different things. That's not a crime. It's just sad. It's more than sad now. Now there's Cyrus, and whatever he's planning, which brings us back to the real problem. Lydia set down her sewing. Not the past, but the present. What are we going to do about him? Nothing if we can help it. Tom's keeping an eye on him. I'm staying out of his way. Hopefully he'll get bored and leave. And if he doesn't? Asa didn't have an answer for that. That evening, Cyrus made his next move. He approached Sheriff Birch's office just as Tom was about to lock up for the night. "Sheriff," Cyrus said pleasantly. "Mind if I have a word?" Tom hesitated, then gestured him inside. "Make it quick. I've got supper waiting at home. I'll be brief." Cyrus settled into the chair across from Tom's desk. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about Asa McGraw. Thought you'd want to know. What kind of stories?" "The kind about a man who might not be entirely honest about his past. The kind about a fight in a mining camp up near Copper Ridge, a bad fight. The kind where someone ended up hurt real bad." Tom kept his face neutral. "Where'd you hear this?" "I sent a telegram to a friend of mine who works the camps. Asked him to look into McGraw's time up there. He got back to me this afternoon." Cyrus pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Want to read it?" Tom took the telegram and scanned it. It described a fight at a camp called Devil's Gulch between Asa McGraw and a man named Pete Sutton. McGraw had beaten Sutton badly enough that the camp doctor thought he might die. McGraw had left before any consequences could be enforced. "Says here Sutton recovered," Tom noted. "Also says he started the fight. Does it matter who started it if the result was nearly killing a man? Context always matters, does it?" Cyrus leaned forward. "Because I'm thinking, a man capable of that kind of violence, maybe he's not as reformed as he claims. Maybe he's just waiting for the right provocation. Maybe my sister-in-law is lucky he decided to be merciful, because if he'd decided otherwise—" "Stop." Tom's voice was hard. "I know what you're doing, Cyrus. You're trying to paint Asa as dangerous so that when you make your move against him, you can claim it's justified. I'm not going to be part of that. I'm not trying to paint him as anything. I'm just presenting facts. You're presenting one side of a story from 5 years ago. Asa's been nothing but respectful since he came back to Cold Creek. He's working honest jobs, building a life, about to become a father. Whatever he did in a mining camp half a decade ago doesn't change that, but it does change how people see him, doesn't it?" Cyrus stood, especially when they learn he kept it quiet, when they wonder what else he might be hiding. "Get out of my office! I'm going!" "But Sheriff, you might want to think about where your loyalties lie. With the law and the safety of this town, or with a man who might be more dangerous than you think?" After Cyrus left, Tom sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the telegram. Finally, he locked it in his drawer and headed home, but he didn't eat much supper that night, and his wife could tell something was weighing on him. "Tom?" she asked gently. "What's wrong?" "There's trouble coming," he said. "I can feel it, and I don't know if I can stop it. Can anyone? Maybe Asa. Maybe if he confronted Cyrus directly, called his bluff, or maybe that's exactly what Cyrus wants. To provoke him into doing something he'll regret." Tom nodded slowly. "You're probably right. But doing nothing while this man tears apart someone's reputation, that doesn't sit right either. Sometimes there's no good choice, just the least bad one. And what's the least bad choice here?" His wife squeezed his hand. "I don't know, love. But you'll figure it out. You always do." Tom wished he had her faith. That night, unable to sleep, Clara looked out her boarding house window at the dark street below. She could see the light in Asa and Lydia's house, a warm glow in the darkness. She wondered what they were doing, probably getting ready for bed, probably talking about the baby, probably planning their future, and she wondered what she'd cost them with her moment of violence. Not just the immediate harm, but everything that had come after. Cyrus's arrival, the rumors, the threat of more trouble. She'd set something in motion that she couldn't stop, and it terrified her. In the room below hers, she could hear Cyrus moving around, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He was whistling, actually whistling like he was enjoying himself, and maybe he was. Some men liked destruction for its own sake. Like the feeling of power that came from tearing down what others had built. Clara thought about going down there, confronting him, telling him to leave Asa alone. But what good would it do? Cyrus had never listened to her before. He'd always seen her as weak, as someone who needed managing, just like he'd seen his brother. A memory surfaced, unbidden. James's funeral. She'd been standing at the grave, barely holding herself together, and Cyrus had come up to her afterward. "You'll sell the business," he'd said. Not asked, stated. "I'll give you a fair price. You can't run it alone." She'd looked at him. This man who'd never shown his brother a moment of kindness while he was alive, and felt something harden inside her. "No," she'd said, "don't be foolish. A woman alone." "No," she'd repeated. "It's mine. James left it to me. I'm keeping it." Cyrus's face had gone red. "You're making a mistake." "Then it's my mistake to make." He'd left in a fury, and she hadn't seen him again until today. She'd taken the freight business and transformed it into a boarding house, proving she could not only run it alone, but make it thrive. She'd thought he'd forgotten about that slight. Apparently not. This wasn't really about Asa at all, Clara realized. Or even about family honor. This was about Cyrus finally having a chance to put her in her place. To prove she should have listened to him all those years ago. Asa and Lydia were just collateral damage in a fight that had started long before they'd arrived. The thought made her feel sick. She'd attacked Lydia out of jealousy and pain, and now Cyrus was using that attack to justify his own agenda. Between them, they'd created a mess that might destroy everything. She had to fix this somehow. But how? The answer came to her slowly, reluctantly. She had to talk to Asa again, had to warn him about what Cyrus was really after, had to tell him the whole story about the Dane family dynamics, about why Cyrus was really here, and she had to apologize to Lydia, really apologize. Not the meaningless words she'd offered in the sheriff's office, but a genuine acknowledgement of the harm she'd done. It wouldn't fix everything, but it might be a start. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd find a way. Tonight, she just had to survive the knowledge of what she'd set in motion and the fear of what was coming next. Outside, the mountains stood silent under a blanket of stars, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in the valley below. The wilderness didn't care about honor or revenge or justice. It just existed, patient and eternal. Sometimes Clara envied that indifference. It must be nice, she thought, not to feel anything at all. But then feeling nothing would mean missing the possibility of feeling something good again someday. And despite everything, despite all the pain and the mistakes and the bitter years, Clara found she wasn't quite ready to give up on that possibility. Not yet.